Dear colleagues, dear friends, welcome all you back to this, the last phenomenological lecture, actually this year, and also in our Friday lecture series, 2022. In this lecture, I think Professor Stephen Crow will introduce us to a very contemporary debate on the method and nature of transcendental phenomenology. I know this debate, especially with respect to the relation between phenomenology, for most of time understood as a kind of epistemology, and metaphysics, quite foreign to most of our audience here. But I hope you can still, learn something from this exchange with Professor Stephen Crow. Now, please join me to welcome Professor Crow.
Thank you very much again for that kind introduction and for the opportunity during these series of 4 lectures to share my ideas with a wide audience in the People's Republic and elsewhere. I want to say a word before beginning. The former 3 lectures really belong to a book project that I'm working on trying to establish what I call a normativity first account of reason. And tonight I want to turn to a different book project that I'm working on that has to do with the relation between phenomenology and metaphysics. Tonight I'll be talking about, or today I'll be talking about the relation between Husserl's phenomenology and metaphysics, but in the book I extend this to Heidegger as well. It's an interesting fact that Heidegger began to develop a positive conception of metaphysics around the time when he finished Being in Time. Before that, he had a negative attitude toward traditional metaphysics. But somehow, at the same time that Husserl was working on, in the late 1920s, when Husserl was developing his metaphysical monadology in a certain way connected with Leibniz, Heidegger too was developing a positive conception of metaphysics drawn from phenomenology, and that also had Leibnizian roots. And Heidegger took it in a political direction. I won't say anything about that unless people ask about that later. Husserl seemed to take it in a more theological direction. And my general metaphysics is understood by both of them as an inquiry into the totality of beings. So it's not an inquiry into being, like Heidegger, like Being in Time, but into beings. And this, I argue, is problematic for a number of reasons. And so the book is really trying to make this case about the relation between transcendental phenomenology in Heidegger and Husserl and the question of metaphysics. And of course, metaphysics has suddenly become very popular, or supposed metaphysical questions have become popular, especially in France. There's a so-called theological turn in phenomenology, which is essentially a metaphysical turn. We have critics, continental-oriented critics of phenomenology who develop something called speculative metaphysics or speculative realism by criticizing the phenomenological starting point. And then, of course, in the last 20 years in analytic philosophy, metaphysics has become a really hot topic, primarily derived from David Lewis's work on modal logic. And so I'm beginning to see connections between the phenomenological turn in metaphysics and the analytic turn. And I bring up a little bit of that in this paper. The main idea is that phenomenological philosophy is grounded in evidence, and that metaphysics, as practiced both in analytic philosophy and in the French version of metaphysical phenomenology, has to go beyond evidence and appeal strictly to rational argumentation. And my argument is, as you'll see, that this leads, in my view, these projects into something like Kant's antinomy of reason. So both books actually really depend on something that I haven't fully developed yet, which is a critique of the principle of sufficient reason. I won't say anything about that here, but that's, I think, the metaphysical principle that has to be abandoned, both in a normativity first account of reason, and also it undermines, if it is abandoned, it undermines the project of phenomenological metaphysics. So you can think of this as a defense of transcendental phenomenology as I take it to be, and you'll see. Primarily, I guess what I want to say is that phenomenology is a research program, and it isn't owned by anyone. It doesn't belong to Husserl, and it doesn't belong to Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty or anyone. It's a way of doing philosophy, and that's what I want to essentially defend in these book projects. So without further ado, I'll try to begin. As I said, this paper will be, part of it will be published in a collection edited by Jeff Yoshimi called Horizons of Phenomenology. And this was occasioned by the publication recently of a volume in the Husserliana series, his collected works, called Grenzprobleme der Phenomenologie, limit problems or limit problems of phenomenology, problems that challenge the basic form of phenomenology as a reflection on normatively constituted meaning. So in any case, that's it. Let me begin. We have a little ways to go here. So Horizons of Phenomenology, Metaphysics. What is the relation between Husserl's phenomenology and metaphysics? The recently published Grenzprobleme der Phenomenologie provides us a new window on this multifaceted question. And here I will focus specifically on one of them. Does transcendental phenomenology entail that physical reality metaphysically depends on consciousness? My own view is that it does not, though Husserl does seem to have thought that it did. In section 1, I will say a bit about what I take transcendental phenomenology to be. In section 2, I will sketch my view of the metaphysical neutrality of transcendental phenomenology. In section 3, I examine 3 recent approaches to the relation between transcendental phenomenology and metaphysics, representing a spectrum of views on the topic. And in section 4, I suggest that Husserl's own conception of that relation is entangled in something like Kant's antinomy of reason. First section is phenomenology and contemporary philosophy. Elsewhere, I've argued that what distinguishes transcendental phenomenology is its focus on normatively structured meaning. This is what Husserl had in view in the approach to consciousness made possible by the transcendental reduction. Today, however, many Husserlians seem to think that a position is phenomenologically significant only if it genetically pursues intentional content back to modes of consciousness that lack normative structure. I remain unconvinced. As I see it, such proposals are to be evaluated on the basis of whether they are necessary to account for normatively structured meaning, that is, canonical intentionality, or what Heidegger called the as structure. That is our best point of reference for assessing their validity. In the absence of such a point of reference, we are free to accept or reject such proposals according to our whim as more or less interesting speculative visions. This insistence on there being some check on the validity of philosophical claims informs the phenomenological principle of evidence, and it determines the specific sense in which phenomenology is a transcendental philosophy. More pointedly, to retain its distinctive kind of epistemic authority, phenomenology cannot abandon its focus on intentional correlation. Phenomenological philosophy is what one gets when one adopts the reflective stance and remains exclusively within it. But even if reflection picks out the topos or domain of phenomenological inquiry, namely experience as a descriptively accessible correlation structure, it is equally important to emphasize that the meaning which inhabits this experience is normatively accessible. For instance, experiencing something as a snake, a tree, or an apple involves conditions of satisfaction that are right there in the experience, at stake in it. And the role of such normative conditions must therefore be reflectively described. If this is true, then whatever ground is attained by a phenomenological reflection on conditions of possibility must be something that is responsive to norms as normative. This puts strong constraints on what can be invoked in phenomenological philosophy. Like logic, phenomenology is not restricted to philosophy. Logic serves as a necessary tool in all domains of inquiry, and phenomenology, understood as careful attention to the way things show up for us in first-person experience, has a similarly essential role to play in any discipline where something like evidence establishes what that discipline is about. Sometimes phenomenology's contribution is a critical one. For instance, phenomenological reflection can identify points at which physicalist presuppositions distort the way questions about perceptual content are raised in cognitive psychology. Sometimes the contribution is more positive. Phenomenological reflection on embodiment and temporality contributes directly to work in cognitive science, and phenomenological reflection on empathy and intersubjectivity has significant implications for research in the social and human sciences. But if we're talking about phenomenological philosophy, things look different. Philosophy is a complex practice of inquiry with its own norms and stakes that circumscribe what is at issue in doing philosophy. Of course, as a social practice, the norms and stakes of philosophizing are frequently contested and hierarchized in different ways, producing schools and traditions within a broader field in which at least some normative commitments are shared. Here is not the place to analyze this sort of practice in detail. My point is only that, in contrast to phenomenology's role in relation to other disciplines, phenomenological philosophy must, according to Husserl, and rightly in my view, be pursued within what Husserl called the epoche. That is, philosophy, which has a stake in ultimately grounded truth and so follows the practical norm of presuppositionlessness, can borrow nothing from other sciences as premises for its own inquiry. Husserl introduced this demand in his critique of naturalism, or better, scientism. There need be no necessary conflict between consciousness and nature in all possible understanding of these terms, but Husserl objected to the idea that natural science should dictate the terms in which philosophical questions are asked and answered. Instead, philosophical questions must address the field of normatively structured meaning that becomes thematic through the transcendental reduction. The general question for today, then, is whether the reduction leaves room for phenomenological metaphysics. I'll say a bit about what the reduction is shortly. Husserl viewed phenomenology as a way of investigating the constitution of that meaning through which entities are given. It is not an investigation into the properties of entities. In contrast, it is often thought that metaphysics investigates the essential properties of entities and provides causal or otherwise grounding explanations for what there is. So our question becomes, by what means could phenomenology move from a transcendental concern with meaning to a determination of the basic properties of entities, to a metaphysics of what Husserl called ultimate facta? If the empirical sciences explore the properties of entities, namely empirical realism, perhaps Kant was right to hold that philosophy has no access via argument or some intuitus originarius to more basic metaphysical properties of those entities. And if that is so, a metaphysics of ultimate facta is not a cognitively grounded inquiry. When it seeks to ground its cognitive authority by drawing premises from the empirical sciences, metaphysics becomes worldview. Ted Sider's physicalism is refreshingly direct about this. His argument for being metaphysically realistic about what he calls structure concludes by summarizing the worldview that results. It consists of an ideology, that is a set of primitive terms, a fundamental theory phrased in terms of the ideology, which identifies metaphysical laws more basic than the laws of physics, and a metaphysical semantics for non-fundamental discourse, which uses the ideology as a translation manual for ordinary linguistic usage. Some contemporary phenomenological metaphysics is pursued in a similar way. Just as the physicalist moves from a sense of physical established in natural science to a reduction of all phenomena to the physical as their metaphysically fundamental reality, some phenomenologists inflate a certain concept that derives from phenomenological reflection on first-person experience into a fundamental principle of the whole of what is: flesh, desire, monad, the given, gift, and so on. Such approaches pose a challenge to the claims, in comparison very modest ones, of transcendental phenomenology. And unfortunately, the Husserl of the Grenzprobleme seems to join this camp. But in what sense, if any, do phenomenologically crafted concepts retain their meaning and authority when extended to domains where no first-person evidence is possible, to the actually infinite totalities, world, God, monad, which Husserl calls totality problems? So now I'll say a little bit about my own view, transcendental phenomenology and metaphysical neutrality. Let us ask this question more specifically. Is Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, governed by the reduction and inseparable from transcendental idealism, a metaphysical idealism? Does it have metaphysical implications? Husserl argued that though phenomenology excludes every naive metaphysics that operates with absurd things in themselves, it does not exclude metaphysics as such. But what does Husserl understand by metaphysics here? This question has recently received a good deal of attention, focused on Husserl's idea that transcendental subjectivity has the character of a monad, and that the ground of the world is a community of monads which exists absolutely, and to which the world, with all its transcendent realities, is relative. A clear statement is found in Cartesian Meditations, where Husserl proposes to call the ego, taken in its full concreteness, by the Leibnizian name monad. He continues, the ego can be concrete only in the flowing multiformativity of his intentional life, along with the objects meant, and in some cases constituted as existing for him in that life. Manifestly, in the case of an object so constituted, its abiding existence and being thus are a correlate of the habituality constituted in the ego pole himself by virtue of his position taking. Further, the monad must be in communion with others like himself, a member of a community of monads, without which there can be no objective world of experience. Such communion, constituted in empathy, replaces Leibniz's pre-established harmony. Husserl argues that because communion between monads is in principle unlimited, there can exist only a single community of monads and only one objective world. Here I will focus on a single strand of the monadology issue. Within transcendental idealism, what does it mean to say that the world depends on consciousness? Now, this question is not unambiguous, and the ambiguity turns on the meaning of the phenomenological reduction. In Ideas 1, Husserl introduced the reduction in the context of an epistemological project involving a Cartesian search for a presuppositionless beginning in philosophy. The ordinary realism of the natural attitude, roughly the view that the world and things in it are simply there as they present themselves in experience and serve as the ground of all cognitive and practical projects, is to be suspended, that's his term epoche, in order to reflect on the perceptual and other conscious acts in which worldly things are given as the things they are. These acts, responsive to norms of validity, enable experiences to be mutually legitimated or corrected by means of each other, rather than merely following upon or subjectively replacing one another. The reduction, then, is the reflective method that discloses the correlation between conscious acts and their intentional objects, and the syntheses of identification in which the meaning of those objects is constituted. Husserl calls this correlation structure absolute consciousness, and I will argue that this absolute should be understood in a metaphysically neutral way. What do I mean by metaphysical neutrality? The epoche, or bracketing the natural attitude, precludes us from positing the existence of objects that show up in the natural attitude. That is, we make no use of their supposed valid being in any kind of philosophical explanation. Of course, we do not deny their existence either. Rather, they are reflected upon solely as unities of meaning correlated with specific types of acts of consciousness, united with one another in the unity of one stream of consciousness by means of temporal and founding relations. That's roughly the theory of the reduction. According to Husserl, it is exclusively within this correlational unity of consciousness that the evidence supporting all natural attitude positing of being can be critically assessed for its scope and adequacy. The transcendental phenomenological concern, in other words, is not whether this tree actually exists. Rather, it is solely the epistemological one of identifying the essential evidential demands involved in positing the tree as what it is, including its claim to exist. If metaphysics has to do with claims about what there is, then transcendental phenomenology is metaphysically neutral in the sense that it makes no such claims, but only claims about how things present themselves evidentially as being. Dan Zahavi, criticizing this view, summarizes it this way. On such a reading, all that transcendental subjectivity can be said to be constituting is the meaning of the world and not its being. But what does being mean here? Husserl's account of the reduction in Ideas 1 might appear to undermine the metaphysically neutral interpretation. A key text in this regard is section 44 of Ideas, where Husserl argues for the merely phenomenal being of something transcendent, that is, empirical reality, and the absolute being of something immanent, that is, consciousness. What does absolute being mean? Husserl initially answers by considering the different kinds of evidence in which consciousness and transcendent reality are given. A transcendent thing is given in profiles or adumbrations that always entail more than what is sensuously given. One side of the tree, I see one side it entails, or it's given as having a backside, but the backside is not present. That's an adumbration. Hence, the evidence for transcendent things' existence is always presumptive. In contrast, consciousness or immanent being, grasped in the evidence of reflection, is not presumptive. Consciousness is not adumbrated or given through profiles. So the existence of consciousness is apodictically given in any genuine grasp of one of its moments, even though the temporally structured stream of consciousness as a whole can no more be given adequately than can a transcendent thing. So consciousness is absolute being in the sense that the validity of its claim to exist now does not depend on the further course of experience. On this picture, transcendental phenomenology can remain metaphysically neutral because in considering this type of evidence, it can acknowledge the distinctive way in which the existence of consciousness is given without, however, making any use of it in explaining the metaphysical nature of things. Phenomenology is not in the business of explaining the nature of things. Transcendental idealism is just the recognition of this asymmetrical correlation structure that underlies the realism of the natural attitude. Husserl says, transcendental idealism contains natural realism entirely within itself. However, the language of section 44 can be read in a more metaphysical way when Husserl later seems to suggest that transcendent reality is not merely relative to consciousness in the sense that its meaning and validity is constituted in consciousness, but rather depends on consciousness for its existence. Reality, he says, is, according to its sense, a merely intentional being which can be determined only as something identical belonging to motivated multiplicities of appearances. Beyond that, it is nothing. Indeed, in the absolute sense, reality is nothing at all. Further, Husserl argues that no real being is necessary to the being of consciousness itself. The metaphysical picture would then be this. Through the reduction, I see that consciousness exists necessarily, while its transcendent correlates are phenomena bene fundata, posits whose existence has continually demonstrated itself in the evidence of ongoing experience, and in relation to which nothing currently speaks against the expectation of their continued existence. On such a reading, consciousness is a monadic unity with its own thoroughly peculiar forms, a unity that in itself has nothing at all to do with nature, with space and time, or substantiality and causality. Transcendent things, in contrast, as unities grounded in syntheses of identification, depend on consciousness, cannot exist without their metaphysical ground. So if absolute means metaphysically fundamental, transcendental idealism would be a metaphysical idealism. The ambiguity in section 44 is incorporated into Husserl's conception of consciousness as a monadic unity. In philosophy as rigorous science, so earlier than ideas, Husserl introduced the term monad in a metaphysically neutral way, namely by highlighting two distinct modes of evidence. The monad's unity is provided by normative forms or laws that enable experiences to correct or refute one another rather than simply replace one another in time, whereas nature or transcendent reality is governed by non-normative relations of space and time, substantiality, and causality. Here, monadic unity is Leibnizian only in the sense that normative laws do not permit admixture with non-normative laws of nature. Husserl does not claim that only monads as metaphysical points really exist. But by the time of Crisis, his 1932 work, a hint of metaphysical idealism is unmistakable. He says the monad is completely closed off within itself, existing in its own way. This way of existing allows for communalization. Indeed, the individual monad functions constitutively only within intersubjectivity. That is, the world as a valid meaning construct is grounded in a community of monads. As Daniele De Santis has shown, in Cartesian Meditations, Husserl uses this transcendental premise to argue to a metaphysical result, namely that there can be only one actual world. Still, by itself, such a metaphysical result does not directly address the question of whether the world itself and everything in it depends on the monadic community for its existence. The claim that it does is defended in A.D. Smith's metaphysical reading of transcendental idealism. Smith argues that for Husserl, the monadic community exists absolutely, and physical or transcendent things supervene on consciousness. Given the right combination of conscious acts, a physical world must exist and its correlate. But physical things can no more exist apart from those acts, their supervenience base, than a game of rugby can exist without its supervenience base in human behavior, intentions, and so on. The supervenience relation is asymmetrical, since all sorts of human behavior can exist without a rugby game existing, or more to the Husserlian point, all sorts of states of consciousness can exist without a physical world existing. For instance, Husserl describes a stream of experience which allows for no unifying syntheses and so no experience of objects. Thus, the existence of the physical world depends on the existence of consciousness. Physical facts are nothing over and above experiential facts. To pose the question of metaphysical dependence more precisely, I will now turn to 3 recent papers concerned with Husserl's transcendental idealism, focusing on how they understand the dependence of reality on consciousness. Each author holds that Husserl's idealism is consistent with empirical realism, and each recognizes the broadly verificationist role played by reflection on intentional correlation. Further, all 3 seem primarily interested in arguing that transcendental idealism is not wedded to its Cartesian beginnings. The constitution of actual reality requires that transcendental subjectivity be embodied, embedded, and intersubjective. But this argument leaves the metaphysical dependence question open, and here the views diverge. Rudolf Burnett defends something quite close to a metaphysically neutral conception. Dan Zahavi, in turn, argues that transcendental idealism has metaphysical implications, namely of an anti-realist sort. Ulrich Melle, finally, poses the dependence question in the context of what Husserl himself understood by metaphysics. And on that reading, it would appear that a metaphysical understanding of monadology is not entailed by the transcendental reduction, but rests on arguments that are antinomical, just as in Kant. Section 3, then, these 3 approaches to transcendental idealism. Rudolf Burnett characterizes Husserl's transcendental idealism as an epistemological type of idealism, and his aim is to show that consciousness is not a metaphysical absolute. Properly understood, transcendental idealism no longer has any reason to take the dependence of things on consciousness to entail the independence of consciousness from its intentional objects or world. A consciousness that can experience an actual world must belong to that world, must be empirical in a sense that would not run counter to its purity under the reduction. The key to his analysis is found in the distinctions Husserl draws between ideal possibility, real possibility, and actuality. The distinction between ideal possibility and real possibility concerns empirical objects. An ideally possible object, for instance, a centaur, is one that can be imagined quite apart from any connection with the motivated course of our actual world experience. A real possibility, in contrast, is so motivated. It is one for which something makes a case, one that could fit in with our actual realm of reality or world. For instance, it is a real possibility that when I cut holes in the walls and ceiling of my study, I will find wooden joists and studs. Such objects, were they actually given, would be integrated harmoniously into the actual reality that is the field of our common experience. It is motivated by our previous experience. A real possibility becomes an actual reality through its realization, that is, through the accomplishment of an act of intuitive fulfillment, grasping those, actually seeing those wooden studs and joists. A purely eidetic approach to possibility, such as Husserl pursued in the logical investigations, cannot account for actual being, but transcendental phenomenology, which appeals to the criterion of intuitive fulfillment, can. And for Burnett, such an account is a phenomenological thesis, not a metaphysical one. What are the implications of this approach to the question of whether actual things, of this approach for the question of whether actual things depend on consciousness for their existence? First, to be actual is to be more than just a particular case of the essence of reality, since this is still only real or motivated possibility. The actuality of an object, in contrast, entirely depends on the intuitive and actual givenness of this object. But if no series of perceptions can adequately verify the actual existence of a thing, how can such a thing be distinguished from real possibility? Burnett's answer is twofold. On the one hand, establishing something as actual through the realization of a prior real possibility depends on a consciousness that itself actually exists. Such a consciousness is worldly in the sense that it is the course of its own previous experience that provides the norm of adequate knowledge governing the possible validity of its anticipation. But second, this norm is not imposed from the outside. Rather, it is the actual thing itself, a regulative idea, or idea in the Kantian sense, a teleological concept that depends on taking to its limit the merely assertoric evidence in which things show up for us. Thus, the actual reality of the world depends phenomenological on the actual reality of consciousness, that is, on the actual course of experience. An empirical but pure consciousness is thus a factum. Consciousness has the necessity of a fact. Husserl explains that while an eidetic ontology contains the ground for a possible nature, it contains nothing of a factic one. And so facticity is not the terrain of phenomenology and logic, that is ontology, but metaphysics. And he continues, the miracle here is rationality. Since there is no eidetic necessity that the course of conscious experience allows for a strict natural science, the miracle, from the transcendental point of view, is that a correlation obtains between factic consciousness and empirical science in the actual world. Burnett cites Husserl to the effect that it is inconceivable that a thing would exist without this relation to the hic et nunc, the here and now, of the one who actually determines it. But he means that this relation is necessary for any epistemic verification of existence, an interpretation that merely reproduces the ambiguity about metaphysical dependence found in Ideas 1. However, Burnett does distinguish between idealism in a broad sense and idealism in a strict sense. Broad idealism is the ontological thesis of a necessary correlation between the possibility of objects and the possibility of an intuitive consciousness of such objects. Strict idealism is metaphysical. That is, it concerns the facticity of the world. It makes claims about things in themselves, and it makes their actual existence depend on the actual existence of embodied subjects. In the end, then, does Burnett think that transcendental idealism entails this strict or metaphysical form of idealism? It's hard to tell. On the one hand, he notes that when Husserl claims that the meaning of the being of the object depends on its intuitive givenness, this promotes consciousness to the role of a supreme judge of all issues concerning being. But Husserl's account of how the meaning of actual being depends on consciousness is easily understood in metaphysically neutral terms. And Burnett rightly argues that this sort of transcendental idealism is inseparable from Husserl's phenomenology. But this just restates the thesis of broad ontological idealism, and it need not entail metaphysical dependence. Indeed, Burnett concludes by reminding us that transcendental idealism is grounded in Husserl's phenomenology of knowledge, and he warns that every extrapolation of the meaning of Husserlian idealism beyond the limits of this epistemological approach is exposed to the worst sorts of misunderstandings. To my ears, this sounds like a version of metaphysically neutral phenomenology. But if transcendental idealism is not directly a metaphysical idealism, might it nevertheless have metaphysical implications? Dan Zahavi thinks it does, and so we might wonder whether the existential dependence of real things on consciousness is among those metaphysical implications. Zahavi agrees with Burnett on the following. First, transcendental subjectivity is not a Cartesian consciousness cut off from the world. Second, transcendental idealism is not a speculative form of metaphysical idealism. And third, transcendental phenomenology is idealism in a fundamentally and essentially new sense, the proof of which is phenomenology itself. Such idealism does not offer a metaphysical account of reality. Its aim is to justify and understand what it means for the world to count as real and objective. Thus, for Zahavi, the phenomenological correlation revealed by the reduction is basic. The necessity of such correlation and any dependence of things on consciousness it affirms does not entail metaphysical dependence. Nevertheless, as we saw, Zahavi rejects the metaphysically neutral interpretation of the reduction because this would entail that transcendental phenomenology is in principle compatible with a variety of metaphysical views, including metaphysical realism or subjective idealism. And Zahavi is keen to show that transcendental phenomenology is incompatible with both of those. Hence, the dependence question looms large. In what sense is consciousness absolute, such that transcendent things, as metaphysical realism understands them, could not exist without consciousness? Zahavi rejects metaphysical idealist interpretations of dependence for a number of reasons. Causal dependence is dismissed, since this would turn transcendental subjectivity into a prime mover in direct competition with empirical cosmological theories like the Big Bang. Supervenience is also dismissed, since it suggests a phenomenalism that Husserl explicitly rejects. Against such views, Zahavi holds that Husserl's decisive point is that reality, far from being some brute fact that is detached from every context of experience and from every conceptual framework, is rather a system of validity and meaning which needs subjectivity if it is to manifest and articulate itself. However, one might think that this changes the subject. Of course, one might say, if reality is understood as a system of validity and meaning, it can manifest itself only in a correlational context. But this seems to get us no further than real possibility in Burnett's sense. It does not justify Husserl's apparently stronger claim, referenced by Zahavi, that reality depends on subjectivity because it is just as nonsensical to speak of an absolute mind-independent reality as it is to speak of a circular square. Zahavi understands this to mean that an objectivistic interpretation of the world's ontological status must be rejected on phenomenological grounds. Husserl's idealism thus redeems rather than renounces the realism of the natural attitude. But such a realist might ask, doesn't the natural attitude understand the existence of at least some things it encounters to be metaphysically mind independent? Zahavi's position on the meaning of Husserl's idealism involves accepting the argument advanced by Burnet. No object is thinkable as actual without an actual subjectivity capable of realizing such an object in actual cognition. Zahavi formulates the precise sense in which the relation between subject and object is asymmetrical. The absoluteness that Husserl describes to subjectivity pertains to its manifestness, that is, as self-manifesting or self-constituting, it possesses something that all objects per definition lack. Objects are relative and dependent in the sense that the condition for the appearance of any object is located outside that object itself. So far, this is entirely compatible with a metaphysically neutral interpretation. But Zahavi further affirms that transcendental idealism doesn't deny the existence of mind-independent objects in the uncontroversial sense of empirical realism, but only in the controversial sense of metaphysical realism. So to address the metaphysical dependence question, we must consider what metaphysical realism is. As a first approximation, Zahavi describes it as the view that a transcendent reality exists independently of any thought or experience we may have of it. This could mean two things. First, that it is possible for something to exist in principle that in principle precludes all possibility of our experiencing it, a Kantian thing in itself. Husserl, Burnet, and Zahavi all reject this view. Second, it might mean that a given transcendent thing correlated with a series of veridical acts exists whether or not such acts take place. On either meaning, the metaphysical realist holds that if we want to grasp reality, we need to strip away the subjective from our experience of the world, all the ways in which it happens to present itself to us human beings. Thus, Zahavi seems to have in mind a view like Ted Sider's, which aims by means of an artificial language, which he calls ontologies, to establish what is metaphysically real while abandoning both experience and conceptual frameworks other than physics, our best empirical theory about what is. Sider expresses incredulity at the thought that subjectivity could play a role in metaphysics. Further, his knee-jerk realism requires that the physical description of reality be objectively privileged because, he argues, physical notions carve nature at the joints. In phenomenological terms, Sider is convinced that what Husserl calls the physicalistic abstraction from all subjectivity leaves nothing metaphysically fundamental out of account. According to Zahavi, Husserl's transcendental idealism amounts to a rejection of Sider's sort of metaphysical realism. Hence, it is not metaphysically neutral because the reduction has this negative metaphysical implication. A mind-independent physical world, as Sider understands it, is just as nonsensical as a round square. But is it really? Zahavi's argument that it is hinges on the claim that transcendental idealism is defined by its deliberate blurring of the distinction between ontology and epistemology. The meaning of being, existence, actuality, and so on, is defined by reflecting on how that meaning is given in consciousness. But why should this entail that a physical world metaphysically independent of consciousness cannot exist? Zahavi admits that the deliberate blurring in question might appear to yield a rather deflationary definition of idealism. But if it is a form of deflationary ontology, then it precisely leaves the existence dependence question out of account, or else denies that it is meaningful. Amy Thomason, for instance, sees Husserl as embracing a meta-ontological deflationism that rejects substantive metaphysical questions, such as existential dependence, precisely because there is no sense to ontological questions in which they cannot be answered easily by perfectly ordinary semantic standards. As we saw, Zahavi explicitly denies that Husserl's idealism entails that consciousness is the metaphysical origin or source of reality. But he also admits that as a philological matter, Husserl might indeed consider consciousness as a necessary condition for reality, and that if he does, A.D. Smith is right in saying that for Husserl, nothing would exist in the absence of consciousness. But if that is truly Husserl's position, that is, if in contrast to the view of idealism Zahavi himself defends, Husserl's own conception of idealism includes a theoretical investigation of the fundamental building blocks or basic stuff of reality, then it is a metaphysical idealism. I believe that Ulrich Melle is right to find such a metaphysical view on the horizon of Husserl's transcendental idealism. What I want to emphasize about Zahavi's position, however, is that his deflationary reading of transcendental idealism differs from a metaphysically neutral reading only in its argument for the negative metaphysical implication that supposedly rules out metaphysical realism. His argument is grounded in the distinctively phenomenological or transcendental blurring of ontological and epistemological motifs, but this blurring is not itself defended metaphysically. Hence, the anti-realism toward which it points us is, I would argue, best understood in metaphysically neutral terms. That is, as eschewing any argumentation that aims to draw metaphysical implications, whether idealistic or realistic. Indeed, any such implication will run both ways. If phenomenology entails that a reality metaphysically independent of consciousness is impossible, this equally implies that reality metaphysically depends on consciousness. Ulrich Melle takes up many of the themes and arguments that we have encountered in the previous two papers, but with the advantage of interpreting them in light of Husserl's own strict or explicitly metaphysical interpretation of transcendental idealism. Hence, it is possible to locate more precisely the moments in Husserl's argument where metaphysical theses are supposedly entailed by the reduction, and to evaluate the plausibility of this supposed entailment. Melle first notes that Husserl's claims about the relativity of empirical actuality to consciousness belong to an analysis of the different ways in which consciousness and reality are evidentially given. That is, they are meant to motivate the reduction and are carried out still on the ground of the natural attitude. The abyss between consciousness and reality that results from this epistemological reflection thus poses the ontological problem of how the two can be related at all, a problem that non-phenomenological approaches often attempt to solve by means of a picture or sign theory of perception. In another volume from the Husserliana collection of notes that Husserl composed in the 1909 to 1925, called Transzendentaler Idealismus, Husserl extensively refutes such theories, sign theories of perception. There is no phenomenological basis for indirect theories of perception. In perception, the object is given in person, not via some representation or sign. But this introduces a further problem, namely a potential gap between the transcendent object and its immanent appearing. The reduction is supposed to close this gap, and in the texts of Transzendentaler Idealismus, such closure has a strict metaphysical meaning. As Melle notes, Husserl's argument hinges on the idea that in being directed at the real thing, perception is simultaneously directed toward validity in a process of demonstration and justification. The being or actuality of a transcendent thing does not appear as the thing does. It must prove itself, as we saw earlier. If we ask how this directedness toward validity revealed in the reduction can overcome the gap that threatens to leave us stuck in immanence, that is, why the thing itself cannot lie beyond the reach of experience, Husserl will respond that we have understood immanence psychologically and have thereby fallen back into an indirect theory of perception. The reduction then facilitates Husserl's refutation of this kind of skepticism and the false metaphysics of a thing in itself bound up with it. But it does so, as Mella explains, by means of an idealism that understands the dependence of things on consciousness in a metaphysical way, one that goes beyond the deliberate blurring of epistemology and ontology that the Hobby referred to. The key to this interpretation is that in Transcendentaler Idealismus, and despite his frequent rejection of dialectical arguments in phenomenology, Husserl offers a proof for transcendental idealism. That is, he constructs an argument from transcendental or verificationist premises established under the reduction to a metaphysical conclusion which lacks all phenomenological evidence. We are familiar with these transcendental premises. In order to posit the actual existence of a transcendent thing, it is necessary that the thing show itself and maintain itself in an ongoing norm-responsive series of experiences. Though this is never definitive, so long as the thing consistently shows itself in such experience, there is no reason to doubt it, and so also no reason to think that it is merely an appearance. The price we pay for this securing of transcendence, however, is the assertion of an in-principle relativity of actuality to consciousness, which means that the connection between transcendence and consciousness cannot be external, additional, and contingent. As Mella explains, no being and no truth is thinkable without possible givenness and without possible knowledge. To show how this entails a metaphysical conclusion, Mella draws on the distinction between ideal possibility, real possibility, and actuality we found in Burnett's account, incorporating them into Husserl's proof of metaphysical idealism. First, the idea of an actual thing in itself, or actual world outside our own, is merely an ideal possibility, like a centaur, for which nothing in our experience speaks. It is thus equivalent to a fiction. Matters stand otherwise regarding the idea of an actual transcendent thing, which is not now being experienced, such as the wooden studs behind my wall, because we conceive such things as real, that is, as motivated possibilities. And this sort of motivation does presuppose some connection with and reference to a current experience that can be motivated by it. So far, so good. All this remains intelligible within a metaphysically neutral reading of reduction. But for Husserl, it follows that the world owes its actuality to consciousness, that without the latter, there is and can be no actuality. Or, as Husserl writes, if one says that a world could exist without an existing ego that grasps it, this is nonsense. This direct statement of existential dependence is immediately hedged, however. The reason it is nonsense is that the truth of the claim that such an actual world could exist is nothing without groundability in principle, and groundability presupposes an actual ego. So, despite Husserl's metaphysical conclusion, the reasoning behind it still turns on the verificationist premises established by the reduction. Roughly, the very idea that an actual world could exist independent of consciousness is absurd. This is because phenomenology shows that the world is intrinsically, that is, not externally and contingently, relative to consciousness. Intrinsic relativity is established through the reduction to the necessary correlation between the positing of any actual being and an actually existing ego, a coherent, validity-tracking series of conscious experiences. Thus, no claim about an actually existing world that excludes consciousness can be justified. Mella then examines certain predictable objections. In his responses, we can see how Husserl's proof is supposed to work and why, despite its verificationist premises, it must be given a strict metaphysical reading. The first objection holds that even if the groundability of the truth of positing an actual empirical object presupposes an actual ego capable of intuitive acts of fulfillment, this does not mean that the existence of the object of that truth requires it. It does not entail the dependence of the object on consciousness. Mella's Husserl dismisses this objection. Whatever we think we mean by it, once phenomenology has shown that without reference to an actual ego, we are in fact only trading in ideal possibilities equivalent to fictions, the distinction between truth and actual existence proves to be groundless. Of course, as we saw, consciousness can take many forms, some of which are incapable of the norm responsiveness required for any experience of meaning and validity. The existence of a rational consciousness, then, is a pure factum, which we continually experience in ourselves. As Husserl said, the miracle here is rationality. We rational beings can and do make distinctions between ideal and real possibilities, and we do so on the basis of actual experience, which therefore can and must serve as the norm of all being. A second objection is more worrisome. It attacks the conclusion of the argument through a seeming reductio, drawing on the fact of the evolution of consciousness in natural history. How can the actual emergence of consciousness be understood if prior to that emergence, there was no actual ego to anchor its intuitive fulfillment? Husserl answers that just as the actual existence of things contemporaneous with, though not currently experienced by, my actual consciousness, can be established as a real possibility thanks to motivated experiential paths that lead from actual experience to the ends of the earth, so too there is a temporal experiential path anchored in my present that leads from now to the most distant ages of natural history. As Mella explains, the full argument requires that the consciousness in question be worldly, that is, that it has realized itself in the world constituted through its intentional experiences. No sense can be made of an anchoring in an actual ego that is not itself experienced as embodied, embedded, and intersubjective. But Husserl takes this point to entail a metaphysically idealist conclusion. First, if Husserl's proof has gone through, then a merely material world is impossible. The actual world must be a psychophysical world with humanoid creatures in it. This does not mean that the existence of the world metaphysically depends on a part of it, the current human community. With regard to that part, we are still on the ground of the verificationist or conditional phenomenological a priori. An actual world can only demonstrate itself if there is a suitably rational monadic community. This view is consistent with a metaphysically neutral interpretation of the reduction. But on Mella's reading, Husserl goes further. To say that the world does not exist independently of consciousness means that the world cannot first exist as a merely material world in which subsequently and contingently certain material things attain a conscious dependence. Understood in this metaphysical way, the empirical emergence of consciousness in natural history presupposes the prior absolute existence of consciousness. So Husserl accepts the supposed reductio, but he does not find the conclusion absurd because he holds that grounding, in the sense of justification, has strict metaphysical import. With a good deal of understatement, Mella notes that this idea has far-reaching consequences. For instance, Husserl's position somewhat resembles the strong anthropic principle. Since the current world is one in which rational minds can successfully pursue science, the emergence of such consciousness and sapient life is somehow necessary, though this necessity cannot be derived from the laws of physics. But Husserl's claim is in fact much stronger. Because a merely material world is not possible, the metaphysical ground of the world must include consciousness. Phrased otherwise, if anything exists, then consciousness must exist. This is not panpsychism, since Husserl does not maintain that transcendent things themselves possess consciousness as one of their real parts. Rather, the metaphysical ground is absolute consciousness itself, the monad, or rather the monadological community whose members realize themselves as human beings within the limits of birth and death, but whose metaphysical actuality is, as Mella puts it, eternal, or from eternity to eternity. Final brief section, the horizon of phenomenological metaphysics. This last point directs us to one place among many in the Grenzprobleme, where Husserl's metaphysics of the monad appeals to a dialectical argument which moves from a phenomenologically evident premise to a conclusion about a totality problem that exceeds all evidence. First, given the essentially temporal structure of consciousness, Husserl argues that it is impossible for consciousness to begin or end. If that is so, it follows that in what we imagine to be geological periods in which all consciousness was absent, the monadological community did in fact exist, but in a state of torpor or Dummheit. Husserl does not try to clarify what this means beyond making a metaphysical argument for its necessity based on premises delivered by the reduction and its approach to the meaning of being. Nor, as Mella notes, does this argument establish why absolute consciousness or the monadic community awoke to world constitution and how much necessity or contingency there is in this awakening and in the course of world constitution itself. For Husserl, these are teleological questions that remain on the horizon of phenomenological metaphysics, and they go beyond the ontological relativity or deflationary ontological pluralism that follows directly from the reduction. In conclusion, Mella claims that Husserl's proof of metaphysical idealism is meant to free us from the naive realism of the natural attitude, and so constitutes an argumentative alternative to the method of epoche and reduction. In contrast to Zahavi, then, who argued that the reduction redeems the realism of the natural attitude, Mella argues that both the reduction and the metaphysical argument lead to the same metaphysical truth about absolute being, a truth that stands in contradiction to the general thesis of the natural attitude and is indeed the exact mirror image of the latter. In this respect, Husserl's metaphysical monadology is the exact mirror image of Ted Sider's metaphysical physicalism. For both, ordinary things are phenomena bene fundata, but do not figure into the fundamental metaphysical structure of what is. For Sider, that structure includes only physics, logic, and set theory. For Husserl, in turn, metaphysical structure includes only monads and their various levels of constitutive accomplishment. Further consideration of this dispute between the two positions would show that the arguments they employ to arrive at what is metaphysically fundamental are themselves mirror images of one another. Thus, in metaphysics, we find ourselves facing an antinomy. Without direct evidence, we have nothing to go on but pure argumentation, which leads to conclusions that cancel each other out. The lesson I think we should draw from this is not exactly the one that Laszlo Tengeli proposes, namely that we have to do here with a contest between two fundamental worldviews, transcendentalism and naturalism, but it is close. Transcendental phenomenology is and ought to be metaphysically neutral, It should leave worldview proposals to the scientists and the theologians. And with that, we come to the end. Thank you very much.
I have many questions, but I think let's just session the other audience, whether they have comments, remarks, and questions. All welcome, please. Will you please?
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful lecture. I have some very basic questions. The first one is clarifying questions. I want to know in our discussion about consciousness or in phenomenology, what is the concept of metaphysical neutral and the metaphysical dependence or independence? Could you give us some more clarification about that?
Well, it's fairly simple. I mean, phenomenology is a reflection on our conscious experience, right? So I'm in a world that has all kinds of people in it and all kinds of objects of various sorts, and they're all interconnected in various ways in my experience. And Husserl's claim is that we can clarify the meaning of the objects that we encounter. That is to say, how they are constituted in our experience, how we come to take them as tables, chairs, people, and so on, by reflecting on our the flow of consciousness and how it presents these things in a norm governed way. For instance, to experience something as a physical thing in nature, a tree, for example, and to distinguish it from a hallucination or something like that, there are rules that are just built in right into our experience. If it's a hallucination, it will change, it will lack certain features that it should have or must have if I move around to the other side and see it. Or for instance, if I see water on the road in the desert in front of me as I'm driving along, if it's real water, there's a whole rule governed way in which it has to appear subsequently to my experience. Namely, as I get closer, it'll become clearer, and eventually my tires will get wet. I'll experience the actual water there. If it's a hallucination, it will not obey those rules, and it will continue to recede as I drive further toward it. So all of our experience is built up out of these normative relations about what must be the case if that's a real tree as opposed to a hallucination. Or you can say, well, what's the difference between remembering something and imagining something, right? I can imagine, in both cases, I can have, let's just put it simply, I can have both, in both cases, I can have the same image in front of me, my grandmother's house. What's the difference between imagining my grandmother's house and remembering it? Well, there's a rule that says if you're remembering it, then you must have once experienced it. And if you are merely imagining it, that prior experience is not necessary. And Husserl thinks these are essential relations in consciousness, and they're right in consciousness. This is not a theory that comes from the outside. So we gain access to this dimension of our conscious experience by setting aside or bracketing all of our explanatory theses, like, well, what's going on in the brain, or even taking a stand on whether this thing exists or not. We only focus on the stream of consciousness and the rules and the objects that are constituted in it. So the metaphysically neutral position of this method and procedure of reflection says that that's what phenomenology is exclusively concerned with. The laws that and meaning structures that are found in our experience. And if you think about it, everything is found in our experience, right? For instance, all talk about atoms and electrons and so on are really just very complicated strings of intentional implications. I can only be talking about atoms and electrons in an evident way if I'm referring to certain evidence that showed up on certain machines and mathematical theories that are lead me to posit such entities on the basis of all kinds of perceptions and experiments. And all of those things take place in our conscious experience. So that's what phenomenology studies. And so this is what Husserl means by the intentional correlation. For every object, it's correlated to some intentional structure of conscious acts, remembering, calculating, thinking, judging, willing, desiring. All of these are intentional correlates of, have intentional correlates of the desired, the remembered, the dreamed of, and so on. And metaphysical neutral interpretation says that phenomenology does everything it needs to do by focusing on that correlation. That clarifies the meaning of our experience and provides rules for what a thing has to be to account as an object of nature, or a social object, a work of art, or religious belief, or something like this. So it's meaning clarification, and that's what it is. But then the question comes up: well, if the tree, the real perceived tree, is, as Husserl puts it, constituted in consciousness, does that mean that the tree depends for its existence on consciousness? And it seems to me that the answer is no. It just means that that's how we encounter the tree, and that's how we distinguish tree, natural objects, from things that don't belong to nature, and so on. We do that right in our experience, but there's no sense in which the tree is somehow dependent on my experiencing it in this way. But some of the things that Husserl says suggest that this dependence is in fact a lot stronger than that there could be no trees without consciousness that could experience them in these types of acts that present them as really actually existing trees. And you can think of this by, it's easier if you think of it not as natural objects, but as, let's say, artworks. There could be no artworks unless, or any actual social objects, institutions, or anything, unless there was a consciousness that could grasp them as artworks and see them as created meaningfully by an artist or something like this. So you can say, well, in that sense, it seems in a certain way it wouldn't be ridiculous to say that there could be no artworks if there were no consciousness. But it doesn't seem quite the same thing to say, well, there could be no trees or mountains if there were no consciousness. They don't seem to be subjective relative in the way that artworks are, or social institutions, or laws and things like that. So that's the question. Does Husserl's emphasis on the relativity of things to consciousness entail that things like trees and rocks could not exist if there were no consciousness to experience them? in the same way that works of art could not exist if there had never been some consciousness to create them and experience them. And the sort of the kinds of arguments that I was going through in my in the third and longer section all try to parse out what Husserl might mean by saying actuality depends on consciousness. And my point was that on my reading, that's just a verificationist sort of position. I mean, transcendental philosophy is very closely associated with epistemology and verificationist premises. Like, what sorts of evidence do you have to meaningfully assert the existence of trees and rocks? And that doesn't seem to have any direct metaphysical implications. But as we can see from the arguments that I mentioned at the end of the paper, Husserl does seem to think that they do have metaphysical implications, as when he says, a material world could not exist if consciousness did not exist. And my whole paper is just a sense of trying to work out where exactly this idea comes from in Husserl and where I think it goes wrong. I mean, he says, you know, in distant geological times, millions of years ago, there wasn't, we think, naturally, we think that there wasn't any consciousness then, but certainly geological formations and so on were there. And Husserl is led to say, no, since consciousness is metaphysically absolute, there must have been consciousness. The monadological community was sort of sleeping at that time, you know, and it woke up at some point and started to constitute rocks and tables. And A.D. Smith has a slightly different view. You know, he thinks of this in terms of supervenience. Normally, since we're all kind of natural realists, a physicalist metaphysician will say, oh, somehow consciousness and conscious experience, it's not metaphysically fundamental, but it supervenes on physical reality. Just like, well, the liquidity of water and the phenomenal properties of water are not metaphysically fundamental, but somehow they supervene on or go along with, in a rule-like way, atoms and molecules of a certain sort. But A.D. Smith claims that it goes the other way for Husserl, that physical things like trees and rocks are intentional contents of consciousness that supervene on the conscious states. They're not independently existing things, but they are correlates of certain combinations of conscious acts that continually confirm one another as in the course of time. This seems like well, it's a kind of idealism, yeah? And Husserl calls his position transcendental idealism. And so the real question is, what kind of idealism is that? And Smith thinks it's this metaphysical idealism in which physical things or transcendent things depend on consciousness for their existence as supervening on consciousness. So Burnett and I think that this is one of these massive misunderstandings of the implications of the phenomenological approach. Dan Zahavi says, yeah, that Smith's reading is a massive misunderstanding of the real phenomenological approach, but nevertheless, the real transcendental phenomenology does have metaphysical implications. And I think what he means by that is that, although he doesn't quite say this, there cannot be a world that is in principle unexperienceable. Roughly in the sense of getting rid of the Kantian thing in itself. So he calls his position anti-realism. He doesn't call it idealism. He calls it anti-realism, like Hilary Putnam, where to imagine, as Ted Sider does, that there, well, forget Sider, but to imagine a Kantian thing in itself is impossible. A world in which there was no possibility of experiencing what is, a world that we couldn't think. He thinks that this is what physicalism or physicalistic metaphysics tries to defend, and he thinks that this is just as absurd as a round square. And I argue against him that it's not, because if it were, we couldn't even imagine times in which there was no consciousness. That would be, anyway, that's a different sort of argument. And Zahavi and I have been having this argument for, I think, 20 years. So I'm not quite sure that we'll ever clarify it. But in any case, I think the best way to interpret the issue is just to say that phenomenology doesn't have, that it remains metaphysically neutral and doesn't make claims about entities and their properties, and doesn't talk about metaphysical dependence relations between consciousness and the things that are constituted in our experience. I'm sorry I went on so long in that question, that explanation, but would you like to follow up on that at all?
That helps a lot. And my second question is about evidence. When you talk about the absoluteness of consciousness, in your paper, it seems like the transcendent things given in its profiles, maybe in the outer perception, and its evidence is presumptive, and the immanent beings grasp in the evidence of reflection. That you said it is apodictically given, and I'm wondering that all the evidence of reflection is apodictic. For example, that I may reflect on my thoughts or what I ate yesterday, and I may reflect on the number 1 or 1.1 equals 2. Does this evidence, all of this evidence are apodictic or absolute?
Yeah, I mean, evidence is a very central notion, and it has, for Husserl, and it has many different levels and dimensions that he talks about. But in this ideas one, for instance, there is, if I say 1 + 1 is 2, and is my evidence apodictic? Not exactly. I have to see, because I could be making a mistake. But if I understand the rules of mathematics, I can see that it is necessary. So Husserl thinks, but to the point about consciousness, his point is, for my purposes, quite limited. Namely, how does this work? Well, we're only talking about positing the evidence for the existence of something. So compare the kind of evidence I have for the existence of a tree with the kind of evidence I have for the existence of consciousness. And we just limit ourselves to a momentary slice of time. If I see the tree and it's in clear light and everything, I'm pretty darn convinced that it exists. But I also know that I'm only seeing it from one side, and that even though I'm very convinced that it exists, it's not beyond doubt that it does not exist, because if I go to the other side and find out there is no backside or it suddenly disappears, then it's clear that I wasn't grasping a real tree. I was having a hallucination or some kind of, some other kind of experience, because the kind of evidence that establishes the existence of the tree has to be evidence of trees, not evidence of tree images or something like that. So, so despite the fact that in everyday life, we're fully convinced that the world is real and that our course of experience goes on and on confirming that, yes, things within the world turn out to be, not exactly as we see them, but generally speaking, the evidence of perception presents us with real things. And nevertheless, that as far as the existence of those things is concerned, that evidence is never sufficient. As Mela put it, the reality of the tree or the actuality of the tree does not present itself in the same way the tree does. It has to prove itself. The reality of that tree has to prove itself. Whereas the existence of consciousness, if I reflect on my current act of speaking to you and just reflect on my momentary conscious experience, there is no way that that experience could subsequently turn out to be not existent. I mean, I could be wrong about what the content of that experience is. I could be wrong about what exactly I'm thinking at the time or something like that. But the existence of the stream of consciousness in that moment doesn't depend on what happens in the future. It exists right then and there. It doesn't have any backsides that could show that it didn't exist. I mean, even if we're deep in a hallucination or a matrix or something, we have these experiences and they exist. And as I say, I mean, the evidence doesn't establish anything else about the stream of consciousness, because it might stop tomorrow. And I don't know I can't say much about it, but I can say that with this kind of evidence, I can posit existence apodictically. Does that help at all, or what?
Thank you. The last one, in what sense that Husserl characterized consciousness as a monadic unity, and how does a monadological community come into being?
How does it come into being?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's what he. I'm not going to be able to fully answer that question, but because it concerns his theory of empathy. So what he means by the monad, of course, is just this enclosed unity of my experience. In some sense, I never get out of it, right? In some sense, I'm monadological unity. Leibniz thought the monad, right, had all of its properties from the outset, right? They were all there for all time. But mainly the point is that in a very real sense, I can't get outside of my consciousness, because everything that apparently brings me outside of my consciousness is something that shows up in my consciousness. And so I'm not really outside. But then his theory about how I grasp another consciousness does, in a sense, try to take me outside in a radical way. Because what it means to encounter another conscious being, and let's just limit it to human beings, what it means to encounter another conscious being is to have a perception of something that is minded in roughly the same way as I am. So there's a passage from my embodied experience to encountering the body of another conscious being, in which I am pairing with my own. This is what he calls empathy, and he thinks it's a kind of perception, not a kind of feeling with the other or sympathizing with the other. He thinks it's a kind of a distinct kind of way in which we perceive another minded being, and also, you know, quasi-minded beings like dogs and animals of all kinds. But it's interesting because the constitution of such a being in my consciousness is the constitution of a consciousness that I cannot ever perceive directly. I can perceive the consciousness indirectly, so to speak, in the behavior and the communication of myself with that other conscious being, but I never can inhabit their consciousness and so have it with direct evidence. But he overcomes this and said, well, you know, I mean, it's a very interesting analysis. We have to, in order for, I can't go through the whole argument, but in order for me to grasp myself as a human being, that is a natural kind, I have to grasp the other person as a body that is in the context of nature, and I translate that back to myself. I learn what it is to be a human being from the other. One might say, you might do a genetic analysis and say, yeah, I learned this from engaging with the mother or the parents, and there's a whole genetic phenomenology of this. But in order to constitute a world of objective things, that means that that the objects in that world are understood as being available not merely to me, but to all of us. And that's what he means by why consciousness can really only constitute an objective world in community with other consciousnesses, because by itself, we don't have an objective world. We just have a world that's the correlate of my own experience. But we know that nature is there for everybody, so to speak. And Husserl is asking how we get that idea or how it's constituted. And it passes through this communalization of the rational monads with whom we are in community. But of course, that analysis is criticized by people like Merleau-Ponty, and he revises it in various ways, as do many other phenomenologists. But they all agree that the objective world is possible only for a community of communicating subjectivities.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Question.
Okay, let me just very quickly jump in. I like this paper pretty much. Thank you. I think I see something first. I agree with you. The first, I agree that at least on the basis of the Husserlian phenomenology, you are just correct to stress the minimum core of transcendental phenomenology as the intentional correlation on the basis of epistemological and verificationist principle. This is something, the first point which I would like to acknowledge. And the second, I would say this is the minimum core or the starting point for transcendental phenomenology. And the second thing, I also agree with you, is for Wu Hikman, he also my phenomenological teacher. I think he stresses the metaphysical conclusion in Husserl. I think on the basis of worldly humans. So this is a kind of the subjectivity or the absolute consciousness is worldly. So this is the ground for this kind of metaphysical reading. But the problem it's just here, especially with respect to your antinomy conclusion, what kind of concept or word is presupposed here? And I think, especially with respect to this Kantian antinomy conclusion, the word seems to be equated to the Kantian notional word, namely the omnitudo realitas. So this is a notional word which is something equivalent to the object or the constituted object. So the first question, whether we should make a differentiation between the notional word and the notion of object or the Gegenstand, because they are not exactly the same to each other. Without this equivalence, it seems very hard to conclude from that metaphysical interpretation of the Husserlian, the becoming worldliness of subjectivity or the absolute consciousness, and this antinomy conclusions. This is my first question.
Yeah, I missed the name of the person who you said was advocating a metaphysical conclusion.
Wu Hikman. It's the Mel, as you said in your paper. Yeah. Yeah. Mel actually, as you said in your paper, you said Mel goes on to explain the full argument requires that the consciousness in question be worldly, namely that it has realized itself in the world constituted through its intentional achievements. So this is a kind of the ground for this metaphysical conclusion.
Yeah, no, I think that isn't the ground for the metaphysical conclusion. As I was explaining with the empathy, this whole point that Vernet, Zahavi, and this anti-Cartesian point that Vernet and Zahavi and Mella all agree to and embrace, namely that constitution of the objective world requires that the consciousness that is constituting be not a Cartesian thing without a body or whatever, but that it comes to understand itself or realize itself in and through conscious acts that allow a sense of its own body to emerge, and with it, the sense of community with other consciousnesses. So it's embodied, and it's, when he says embedded, the embodiment here is embedded in a world that it becomes part of nature. The concept of consciousness in Husserl is not limited to human beings in the sense that this particular nature and this particular constellation of worldly things is the only one that is possible. There are all kinds of ways in which an embodied, embedded, and intersubjective consciousness might come to actualize itself within a context of a world. So that doesn't have any direct metaphysical implications. It's just a phenomenological necessity in terms of the meaning of constitution. But Mella thinks that that Husserl actually goes further, and here's why I was focusing entirely on the question of the metaphysical dependence of objects or physical reality on consciousness. Husserl thinks that this character of the embedded, embodied, intersubjective character of the constitutional achievement actually has metaphysical implications that are quite paradoxical, namely that any kind of physical reality, any kind of transcendent reality, non-conscious reality, is itself relative to and dependent on this constitutional process. And my claim is that I don't see anything like that kind of entailment holding. What the embodied and embedded, sort of character that Husserl discovers as necessary for constituting the world. I mean, it's the attempt there is simply to enrich our conception of our conscious experience, so we don't conceive it merely as intellectualistic judging and cognitively grasping a world that stands in quite apart from that process of coming to inhabit it. Those two things go together in the correlational structure. The metaphysical conclusion is when Husserl argues that the being of my own embodiment, or the being embedded in nature, the existence of that nature and the existence of that body somehow depends metaphysically on there being a consciousness or a community of consciousnesses that constitute it. And without those consciousnesses, there wouldn't be any nature or any physical reality. And that's the conclusion that Mella tries to show is implicit in Husserl's, not only implicit, but that Husserl argues for that point in various places. And Mella tries to defend it in certain ways. And it's more complicated than that, but I mean, one can say behind such a view in Husserl's case was religious conviction. And he, toward the end of his life, I mean, he made these arguments. Well, I've made an argument for the immortality of the soul, because consciousness has a temporal structure, immanent time. And every moment of consciousness is not just some momentary thing, not connected to the previous moment. The structure of internal time, whenever I have some experience in the now, that experience is already structured by a retention of a previous now and a protension or an anticipation of the subsequent now. And if momentary consciousness has that structure, then for any given now, when I exist, there was necessarily a previous time when I experienced what I'm now retaining. And since I couldn't have experienced that without a previous retention of the previous time, his claim is that consciousness can neither begin nor end. And he thought this was a proof for the immortality of the soul. So my point is that this strikes me as a Kantian antinomy. It strikes me as the antinomy of first cause, and he has other ones that are like composite, that antinomy of composition, smallest particle, no smallest particle. And those are just arguments. I mean, and he thinks they're demanded by phenomenological evidence, but only, I think, if you have some prior convictions about what you want metaphysics to be. And that's the same as, I think, a lot of contemporary physicalist metaphysicians like Sider proceed. Obviously, you know, the world we experience is rich with different kinds of objects and different kinds of things. And but the physicalist is so impressed with physics that they want to go even deeper and say, well, if we draw metaphysical conclusions from what ordinary empirical physics says, we eventually are able to get rid of the reality of subjectivity. And you know, it's some epiphenomenon or something like this, that the really real stuff doesn't contain any spooky entities like consciousness or things like that. And they can't make such an argument on the basis of any kind of evidence. They can only make it on the basis of pure argumentation. And so I take this to be an instance that Kant diagnosed in transcendental philosophy, when theses that are perfectly acceptable, when categories that are perfectly acceptable and cognitively valid, when applied to what Kant called, you know, experience or phenomena, turn into those categories become empty. And when what we're talking about are totalities like God, freedom, and immortality in Kant, or the world totality, the world as a whole, and so the arguments, you know, there is a first cause or there isn't. These arguments start with the valid premises, and when they exceed evidence by simply employing categories beyond the bounds of possible experience, they end up with contradictory conclusions. And so I guess that's what I'm thinking about why there's a difference between evidence, the evidence structure that we can appeal to when we're talking about all kinds of things that we can experience, all kinds of, and I'm just calling those objects, but they have many categories of being. I could make the same argument with Heidegger. I think he falls into exactly the same problem at exactly the same time. But when we move to totalities, like Heidegger calls das Seiende im Ganzen, beings as a whole. Then our phenomenological categories, which are perfectly valid when we have evidence of such things, fall apart, and we're left only with argumentation on the basis of pure reason, or what Kant would call using the principle of sufficient reason to try to get us out of the limits of possible experience. And we fall into contradictions. And I haven't made that argument fully, obviously, in this context, but that's my hunch. And yeah, these totality problems that Husserl talked about, well, you know, the problem is that experience doesn't give us any totalities. When Heidegger says, you know, our access to the world as a whole is primarily through bare mood. Well, we don't get any cognitive significance from this. We only get how the world matters to us. And so that when he starts talking about the world as a totality of entities, he finds, I think, that there's nothing to say about that. We can't, or we can say anything. I mean, does the world have a beginning in time, or, you know, is it endless in space, or is it not? And we have no evidence for that kind of thing. And so those are metaphysical propositions that, in my view, we have no way of judging the truth or falsity of them, if they're even coherent. Of course, I'm a minority view on this. I mean, most people nowadays, as I mentioned at the beginning, even phenomenologists want to build up a metaphysics. For instance, Merleau-Ponty moves from this notion in phenomenology of perception and so on of intercorporeity, and finally in the visible and the invisible becomes a metaphysical position that everything is the flesh. It's some concept that has been drawn from phenomenology, but when applied to the totality of what is, it loses its intelligibility, I think. And Heidegger ran into the same problem when he was in the late 20s and early 30s, when he was trying to tell us what beings as a whole are. And he took it in a political direction. Husserl's was motivated by a theological or religious sensibility, and Heidegger's very strangely deriving from the same Leibnizian premises about the monads, turned it in a political direction, and with very unfortunate results in the early 1930s and mid 1930s. And I think this is a lesson that phenomenologists ought not to be engaged in metaphysics. Or you could put it another way. I mean, Jean-Luc Marion, I mean, he takes the notion of the given that Husserl uses and that we have in phenomenology, and he says, well, the given, roughly speaking, is prior to the intuition. And if we think about that, that means we have to think of the given as a gift. And then the gift, there's a giver, and suddenly he then brings in this whole phenomenon of revelation, and indeed Catholic theology and all of this becomes somehow grounded in phenomenology. And I just think this is the problem of metaphysics. We don't have access, evidentially, to the totalities we want to say something about.
Yeah, wonderful. I agree with all what you said. The only worry is about your derivation from this metaphysical interpretation to the Kantian antinomy conclusion, because here this inference actually based on, seems to me, a very restricted conception of world. namely it's a totality of things. But the problem is whether the world in this sense is really what Husserl has in mind, or maybe that is only available phenomenological notion of world. Or maybe we have the other ways to understand the world. As you mentioned, Heidegger, the early Heidegger Darwin's he obviously shows another version to understand the notion of world. And Merleau-Ponty follows this, the early Heidegger's hints, but to make a very radical transformation of the notion of world. All of these things, I think, differ from the Kantian notion of totality. As I said, it's omnitudo realitas. So it's very different from that. Because of this reason, I think this actually comes to my second question, whether transcendental phenomenology can only be grounded on the intentional correlation. As I said, this is the minimum core of transcendental phenomenology. But is this a single and unique version of transcendental phenomenology? Or maybe based on the Merleau-Pontian, the early Heideggerian, the notion of renewed notion of words, then we could have another, see the transformation of transcendental phenomenology as well.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, I totally agree with you that that my preferred idiom for discussing these would be Heideggerian. I agree that the Heideggerian notion of world is in certain ways superior to Husserl's notion. Although world in Husserl is a notion for a horizon. It has a horizontal structure. It's not just an object and it's not just a totality of objects. But nevertheless, I think that Heidegger's fundamental ontology is superior phenomenology to Husserl's remaining within the language of consciousness and conscious acts. I think Husserl's analysis is compatible with the Heideggerian ontology, but not vice versa. I think you have to start with Heidegger. And the way I mean, my interest in Husserl lies, well, for many reasons, but one thing why I keep emphasizing Husserl is because I think that the essential pieces of Husserlian phenomenology can be included, can be just incorporated as chapters within Heidegger's fundamental ontology. As Heidegger's, basically the way I look at it is that I think Heidegger thought that Husserl basically did the epistemology correctly. Epistemological questions are essentially, questions of judgment and all of this and evidence and those kinds of things are pretty close, not without revision, but they're pretty accurate phenomenologically, and Heidegger just wasn't interested in that. Husserl had done the work, but he failed to get the proper phenomenology of important things like, well, consciousness by itself. If you just think of consciousness, it can't really constitute anything. It has to be the structure of Dasein is actually essential for that. Norm responsiveness. Husserl doesn't really explain what norm responsiveness is and what kind of being one has to be norm responsive in the appropriate way. So I think Heidegger's ontology and therefore also his concept of world in being and time is an improvement over Husserl's. And as you say, it's quite different from the omnitudio realitas of the earlier transcendental tradition and Kant. And my argument actually is that Heidegger takes the concept of world in being and time, which is a transcendental phenomenological concept, and it's an existentiale or a category of Dasein, and then tries to make a metaphysics of world in the late part of Content and Problem Metaphysics, and then also in the lecture courses from the early 30s. And where he is talking about the world as das Seiende im Ganzen. And this is not what he calls the world in Being in Time. World is a normative totality of that's grounded in comportment and care and all of this. But if you read those lecture courses, he's arguing he wants to be Shaler. You know, he wants to be Max Shaler and talk about man's place in the cosmos and things like this. And so he uses arguments that sound suspiciously like the kinds of things that Husserl was trying to do with the Leibnizian metaphysics. And I can send papers where I make that argument about Heidegger's late work, not late work, but just post Being in Time, what I call his metaphysical decade. And I think he very soon recognized that this was a non-starter, that this is not something that can be done, namely move from fundamental ontology to metaphysics, to a theory of das Seiende im Ganzen. It's at the same time that he abandons his, well, when he has to give up the rectorate, you know, in other words, it's the same time when he fails in his attempt to raise the German student body up to become good Germans, Nazis, that he realizes this is based on his metaphysics. And so begins to talk about the project of overcoming metaphysics. And that's a very complicated chapter, as I'm sure you know, or period in Heidegger's work. But I'm trying in this larger project to make a case that from a philosophical point of view, something like this is inevitable when you move from phenomenological evidence or transcendental phenomenology to any kind of metaphysics. And I see dangers there, both on the physicalist, analytic metaphysics strikes me as impoverished, and Husserl's and Marion's and Heidegger's metaphysics strikes me as implausible and dangerous in some ways. I want to stand up for the autonomy of transcendental phenomenology and leave metaphysics. I think metaphysics is worldview formation, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not grounded. It's not what I would call philosophically respectable, but that's just my position, and I hope I can make it clearer in the book form.
Yeah, this actually comes to my final point. If metaphysical discourse, as you said, were regarded as worldviews, I really have a Hegelian objection to this understanding of metaphysics. Whether this is a metaphysics, it is not transcending physics at all. It's just a physics as a supreme form of physics. It is not metaphysical at all.
You mean the physicalist worldview?
Yeah, exactly. That is the physics. It's not meta, because meta must be transcending beyond the physics, right? It cannot retain the form of physics. But this worldview, it's only physical, supreme form. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can only agree with you. My point in bringing up Ted Sider, is that I just want to make an analogy between the desire for metaphysics, both in phenomenology recently and in analytic philosophy. I mean, analytic philosophy worships physics and wants to make the world safe for physics and get rid of spooky entities and things like this. And I think that Sider's arguments in favor of, I mean, he bases it on physics, but then he has to translate everything into semantics, which he calls ontologies, that makes no direct reference to electrons and, you know, wave particles and anything like that. And he thinks that this logical or that he's picking out laws that are deeper than physical laws. And it seems to me just like hocus pocus in terms of using modal logic and set theory to try to claim that this reconstruction is actually anything but, you know, a worldview based on physics. I mean, that's why I started it this way, because he's really clear about that. He says it is a worldview, but he claims that that it's all very rigorous and that you have to get rid of subjectivity and all of this. And that just strikes me as dogmatic. And so my aim there is to work and show that Sider's arguments are also antinomical. When he moves beyond physics to argue for something more fundamental, he's actually no more convincing and no more cognitively respectable than Husserl arguing for sleeping monads back in the day when there were no, when there was nothing but rocks, you know. So I think I share your view. That's why I say leave the worldview proposals to scientists and theologians, and we philosophers can do something else.
Yeah, great. Okay, I think we have to stop here because of the, you know, this already extended time. I think in these 2 weeks, we heard a lot and fantastic things from Professor Stephen Crow on the issue of the origin, contemporary issues of origin of normativity, on the normative first approach to the notion of reason, and also his reflection on the relation between phenomenology and metaphysics. His reaction, phenomenological reaction, I think is very sober, and also the justified reaction to contemporary metaphysical advance, either in phenomenological camp and also in analytic tradition. I think all those things are really very inspiring and really appreciated. Let's once again thank Professor Stephen Crow for this wonderful talks in the past 2 weeks.
Thank you so much. I have learned so much from your excellent questions and engaging with the discussions that we've had. It's very challenging to try to answer such keen and perceptive questions and to have such a philosophically informed audience. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity that you've given me to share my ideas with you and to learn from you. And it's yet another warm memory and important part of my philosophical life, to be connected with Peking University and so many people in China, and from whom I've learned over the last 20 or 30 years in many possible ways. And so I wish you all the best of luck in your philosophical projects, and thank you once again for being so generous with your invitation and your questions.
When international travel resume, we hope one day we could welcome you in person on our campus. Once again, thank you very much, and thank all our audience for your excellent questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye.